is Cindy Lustig. I'm an associate professor here in the psychology department and also in the neuroscience program here at Michigan. And let's see what I do. Well, my research interests sort of are about attention, memory, and their interaction. And it kind of depends a little bit both on what is working in the lab and where the money is coming from, how much we emphasize one or the other. But we do focus a lot on how attention works, and especially in different populations, looking at everybody from college students and older adults. Those are the populations we look at the most, but we've also been taking a look at how brain differences in different patient populations, such as people with schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease and so on and so forth, may also affect things like attention and memory.
Interesting. So then I guess if you could sum up your understanding of how does the brain learn things? How do we learn things?
I would say that probably the simplest way to put it that sort of captures both the phenomena of it and then also what happens neurally is by making connections.
Okay. So elaborate on that.
So, if you want to take a look at it at a neuronal level, new learning in the brain is literally represented by making new connections between neurons. I mean, that's what we call Hebbian learning. The saying is neurons that fire together wire together. So when you have continuing interactions, the brain adapts and changes in accordance with that learning. And one thing that I think we'll probably discuss a little bit more later on is that also some of the same ways that I think we learn facts and concepts is by connecting them also to things that we already learn.
Right. So then, if we were to say, what is the best way to learn something?
I would say that depends on what you want to use it for, right? So the best way to learn something. So let's say. Let's use this situation of something it's that you want to remember for a really long time. It would be, connect it to things that you already know. It's better if there's some kind of emotional component to it, something that you have, will direct your attention to it, and also space out your learning. Recently, there's been a lot of attention on the fact that one of the best ways to learn is actually by testing yourself. So there's some really interesting studies out of several labs, especially Roddy Roediger at Washington University in St. Louis. And what they have been finding is that, especially if it's a test that's going to occur, in the longer term, so a day from now, a week from now, people who study the information once and then test themselves on it 3 times actually do better than people who study it 4 times in a row. So testing yourself actually seems to sort of, I think because the testing, it re-exposes you to the information in a way. It's even better if you do it with feedback, but even testing without feedback seems to work pretty well. And then you're also getting practice in what you're going to have to do on the test, which is retrieve the information, right? A lot of times people who are tutors, or even the graduate students, as they go from being students, they were once undergraduates themselves and now graduate students, and now they're the ones who are in charge of teaching sections. They say, oh yeah, I realize now when I have to teach this that it makes me understand it a whole lot better. I find that even in my own teaching, it's always fun for me to go back, even some of these classic papers that I reread every year, every 2 years, going back and revisiting it and thinking about it again from that perspective, that fresh perspective, helps you to organize the information, helps you to think about it in a different way.
Right. So one thing that popped up is that you mentioned was this attaching sort of an emotional aspect to it, so sort of creating a narrative, I guess, or something like would be
right.
a way of doing it. So what about learning something really fast? Is that?
Yeah, I mean that I think also the emotional component goes along with it too. I mean there's especially if we're in sort of a threat situation or a fear situation, it does seem to be the case that, those brain systems that are involved in sort of, like a fight and flight response and all that, so cortisol responses, all of those things, they do also seem to enhance on a temporary basis learning and memory. Now, as we all know, if you stick in that situation for too long, or if you ramp those systems up too high, then you actually get detrimental effects.
So stress is temporarily inclusive, but
right.
over the long period is really bad.
Right. So one thing, like the example that I give when I talk to my students in my learning and memory class is, a lot of the times, what we study in the lab is, sort of relatively unemotional material, repetition and so on, or, the materials that they're studying for their classes, often, they don't necessarily have an emotional response to it.
Right.
But one of the things that I try to do to help them learn the material is they have to write a discussion every week where they relate the material to something that happens in their everyday life. And so when we can make those kinds of relationships, or, the other thing I say to them is, really, let's think about this. 10 years from now, what are you more likely to remember about your college experience? Are you going to remember, the facts that I taught you in this class? Maybe, if I'm really lucky, but probably not. You're much more likely to remember, the great experience that you had out with your friends, or your emotional breakup with your significant other. Those are the things that are going to stick with you 10 years from now.
I have to learn a semester's worth of material in one night. What do I do?
I see. So, yeah, if you've completely not learned the material, that's not good.
Right.
Now, it is true that if, I'm honest with my students here, if the only thing you have to do is learn that information, spew it back out on a test, and then you can walk out and you never have to remember that information again, cramming is okay. Cramming will work. If you are trying to get an entire semester into 10 hours, good luck. But even then, hopefully if you have had some tests throughout the semester, you have some idea of what kinds of things the professor looks for, so you can start with that. Other than that, I would say look for things that are, what are the big ideas, what are the big themes of things, because you're going to need to start there anyways to help you organize the detailed information.
Okay. So organization is a big...
Organization is always huge, both for, even if you're trying to do that cramming sort of information, and also if you are wanting to know things in the long term.
Mm-hmm. So when I was trying to study for these massive microbiology exams during my undergrad, my strategy was I would print off the PowerPoint slides and then go through and just basically copy the information into my notebook. And sometimes, and over time I realized that I wasn't getting anything out of it.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing it, but then I would go back and be like, well, what did I write? And it
right, exactly.
Thing. And so then what I found worked really well was when I didn't copy it, I paraphrased it.
Exactly. You put it in your own words, you're processing it. In some ways that's a sort of another version of the testing effect, right? So you're making yourself deal with the information and reconceptualize it. It kind of depends. So some people, especially if they're sort of it depends a little bit on the person and on the topic. Another thing that people sometimes recommend, especially if you have a lot of concepts and you have to think about how they're interrelated, is sort of like the mind mapping software.
Okay.
And so these are things it's hard for me to do an example just with my hands here. I can send you one if you're able to insert it into the clips later on. So the idea here is that instead of organizing things like an outline, you organize them in some ways in the way that we think that concepts are sort of arranged for ourselves in our minds, and more like a network. Okay. So like maybe you have a central idea, you have a big central idea. So let's say, this is what I need to know for my learning and memory class final exam. Okay. Here are the topics that we covered. And then there may be, for each sort of session that we had in there. So there may be one on emotion and memory, there may be one on autobiographical memory, there may be one on aging and memory. And so each of those, there's going to be ideas that belong just to those individual topics, but then there's also going to be some connections, right? So autobiographical memory is something we get more of that as we get older. It's also a kind of memory that shows a lot of emotional influences.
Yeah.
So you're going to have some connections in between those. So you basically, the ideas that are interactions between those, but that are more detailed ideas, you kind of put in the middle. And so it's just a way to sort of help you organize concepts and think about the relations of things.
Okay. So
The other thing, again, I was just going to say is, even I think for that kind of keeping your mind focused on it,
right.
There is what we call meta memory or metacognition, which is kind of your knowledge about what you know.
Okay.
And one mistake that people often make, so let's say when you're doing your flashcards or something like that, is you take a look at it and you feel like you know it right away when you learn something. And so just because you know something right now doesn't mean you're going to know it later, right? And so the better way to do it is to do an initial learning and then kind of put your practice off a little bit later, test yourself then, and then ask yourself not only when you get to that flashcard, okay, did I get the right answer now, but also what's my confidence in that answer? Do I feel like I have it, and I can, this just immediately came to me, or do I feel like, yeah, I got lucky on that one? If it's yeah, I got lucky on that one, it needs to go back in the deck.
Okay.
There's actually a great program online that I recommend to people who are preparing for the GRE and the MCATs, since there's the vocabulary sections on there.
Yeah.
It's called freerice.org.
Free rice.
And it helps people to learn vocabulary, and every time that you get one right, it donates a grain of rice to some UN initiative. But the other thing that they do that's really nice is if you get it right, then it goes out of the rotation. If you get it wrong, then it comes back, 2 items or 3 items again, so that you get that reinforcing in that practice.
These are great strategies for like an individual, but
Mm-hmm.
do people learn best on their own, or what about like a group project or something, or like working in a group, a study group? Is that effective, or?
It can be effective sometimes for initial learning.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing it for studying,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually not so great.
Really?
Yeah, so people have done studies. There were actually some early studies that were done here at Michigan, and studying alone time seemed actually to be much more a much better predictor of how people were going to do. And I think in part that's a matter of the discipline of the study group.
Yeah.
A lot of times when you see, my students crack up every time that we go over this, because I say, okay, so you say you spent 3 hours studying as a group. How much time did you actually spend studying? How much did you actually spend? So, I think maybe if you have a very disciplined group and you guys go, people go in with a plan and say, what we're going to do is test each other and quiz each other and explain things to each other that we don't understand. That's why I say, I think the group interaction at the beginning when you're very first learning and trying to grasp a concept, that might be more helpful. But when it comes down to, okay, I understand this stuff and now I need to get ready for the test, it seems, the studies suggest that maybe that's a little bit less useful. And I will say the highest predictor across several studies now of good grades is time spent in class.
Really?
And that is actually correlated with reduced time spent studying. If you take a group of 100 undergraduates in a class, and it's, it's not a perfect correlation, but there's a reasonably strong correlation between who shows up to class and who ends up getting the A.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that should be too surprising.
But interestingly, it's not associated with the amount of time spent studying outside of class.
And that's what really gets me. That's fascinating. Does use of a lot of stimulants over a long period of time have ultimately negative effects on learning?
I don't think we really know that, or at least I'm not familiar with the studies on that. I mean, I can't imagine that it would be too good for you, because just, even having your system revved up naturally over the long term due to stress, and, I mean, in some ways that's what you're spiking up here, is not so great for you in the long term either. So I can't cite you any specific studies on that, but I don't think I would necessarily recommend it.
What about something like music? Does that have positive effects, negative effects? Do we know?
The effects on that seem to be kind of mixed. My guess, and again, people haven't really, that I'm aware of, probed too deeply into the mechanism, is that the few findings that I'm aware of seem to suggest that if music without words might be okay, music with words is probably not so great. I think we've all probably had that happen where we think we're reading and all of a sudden, we're bopping along to Ace of Base or whatever.
A favorite.
And then it's stuck in your head for the rest of the day.
Yes.
But music without words might be okay, if for no other reason that it sort of helps you with that attention part and sort of, keeping people, a little bit more on the aroused side of things. There was a lab that had some preliminary evidence where they were trying to do things like bring in the white noise from, like, let's say a coffee shop, where it's sort of, this white noise thing that's kind of a stimulating environment, but not patterned enough to sort of catch your attention and be distracted. And again, they found kind of wishy-washy effects. I'm not sure what happened with that in the end. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've found I really like, just even for my own work, I mean, everybody has those days where you're more on or off than others, is there's this technique out there called the Pomodoro technique. I don't know if you've heard of this. Okay. So it's, you can actually get, free little timers and stuff to put on your computer, and I recommend this to my students. And basically the idea is that you set a timer, and the timer runs usually for about 25 minutes. And it's called Pomodoro because the person who originally did this with a cute little kitchen timer that looked like a tomato, right? And the Italian word for tomato is Pomodoro. So you set it for 25 minutes, and sort of the idea is you can make yourself concentrate on anything for 25 minutes, especially if you know that the clock is ticking. And then when the 25 minutes is over, the bell rings and you get a 5-minute break, and you're deliberately supposed to step away from things, stand up, take a break or something, basically get yourself, give yourself that break, move around a little bit to sort of keep up that kind of physical arousal kind of state. Now, sometimes if you're really in the groove on something, you might be tempted to keep going. But as I said, especially if you're doing something like studying and maybe it's not the most exciting topic in the world, just knowing that you have that break coming up can be helpful. Our brains are novelty seekers, and so we have to do something to keep them fresh.
So the idea of listening to a recording of something while you sleep.
Interestingly, so you cannot learn the information that way.
Okay.
But if you have learned it, it might actually do you some good to do. So there is some really interesting work out of Ken Powler's lab at, I believe he's at Northwestern.
Okay.
And he had people learn the locations of things, and then he also sort of would play a sound that was associated with it while they were learning the locations of things. So, if you're learning the location of where, the cat is on the grid, let's say, you also would hear the sound of the cat at the same time. So then, while people were asleep, and he had, EEG measures going on while they were sleeping, to make sure they were actually in the sleep stage, they would play at, a low enough volume that it wouldn't wake the person up for basically, I think it was something like half of the items they played the sounds while the person was sleeping. They tested them the next day, and people actually did a better job of remembering the locations of the items that they had heard the sounds for on that test than the ones that they hadn't. And so it's thought that maybe that did actually sort of help the brains kind of replay what it had already learned for those, and we know that, you know, sort of replaying sort of the learning experience while you're sleeping is something that happens that seems to help this consolidation process and so on and so forth. So I would say it won't work so much for initial learning, but, you know, I don't know if, you know, you have to do it just right, and I don't know if we know enough to tell you how to do it just right yet, but there's some hints out there that actually getting it to replay in your sleep is not such a bad thing.
Interesting. Wow, that is fascinating.
Yeah, I can send you the paper for
I'm
that.
very interested to see
Yeah.
that. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think it was a Science or Nature paper 2 or 3 years ago.
Wow. Are they so do you know if they're still looking at this?
Yeah, they're following up on it. They got a grant to follow up on it.
That's wild, yeah. Because I know that's always been sort of like, man, if you could somehow make use of that time.
Right. I mean, well, you know, while you're sleeping, your brain is making use of that time.
Okay.
I mean, I do tell my students that, you know, even when you're cramming, as long as you're sure you're going to get back up again, you know, go ahead and take even a little bit of a nap.
Okay.
Because sleeping, it is really important for learning and memory, and it seems to be especially important for, you know, I was talking before about, you know, sort of pulling out the big picture of things. So it seems to be one of the things that our brain does while we're sleeping and in consolidation of memory is that it helps it to sort of organize, okay, what are the big ideas? What is kind of the gist of this? There's some work out of a lab at Harvard suggesting that if you give people lists of related words, they will be, after they've slept, they will be more likely to sort of remember the big themes of it. Sometimes they will also make mistakes and accidentally remember words that are highly related to the theme but that weren't on the list. But they also remember the words themselves better. And so the idea is that, you know, you're kind of getting the big idea, which in most cases, that's what you're being tested on, right? You know, I mean, in these experiments, you know, we throw in, you know, these lure words to sort of trick people into, you know, so that we can better understand. Usually most of the time we can better understand what the brain is doing and we can get it to make a mistake. Right. But the reason that your brain makes this mistakes is that most of the time organizing information in that way is the right way to go.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts on the idea and questions about like the best way to learn things in a crunch situation?
I mean, the best ways to learn, you know, in general, I would say, you know, pay attention, find a way to organize the information and connect it to something that you already know, and test yourself. Okay. That's really what it comes down to.